My name is David Miller. I'm 52 years old. We didn't live in Oregon. We lived in a quiet suburb of Phoenix, in a house titled in my wife Sarah's name. When we met, she had almost nothing. Debts carried from a previous divorce, 2 teenagers, endless side jobs, and a streak of exhaustion that shadowed every moment of her life. She was beautiful in a tired, worn-down way, and I believed I could carry the weight for both of us. I convinced myself that love meant endurance, that effort could make up for the chaos she'd inherited, and that the brokenness of her past wouldn't define our future. I wanted it to be ours. I wanted it to be mine as much as hers. Over the next 11 years, I poured myself into that house, into her, into the children, into every quiet corner where responsibility demanded attention. I paid off her loans. I covered tuition for her son Aiden and her daughter Claire. Renovations were not mere improvements. They were declarations of permanence, proof that this household could be something lasting. I helped Sarah open a small beauty salon, navigating permits, loans, and contracts. Every transaction was precise, every agreement properly executed. I never demanded gratitude. I never demanded acknowledgement. But I did expect, deep in my chest, a thread of respect, a recognition that I existed in the life I helped build. First, the kids didn't notice. They were teenagers, awkward, moody, clinging to the chaos of adolescence. I tried to see them the way a father sees his children. Imperfect, testing boundaries, sometimes cruel without meaning to be. I worked quietly behind the scenes, waking before dawn to pick up extra hours at the construction site or consulting gigs, then returning late at night, bones tired, hands calloused, to make sure there was dinner on the table, that homework was done, that they could walk into school without the shame of gaps in their clothing or missing supplies. I paid for tutors, bought their books, ferried them to sports practices and piano lessons. I fixed the car brakes myself, took apart the dishwasher when it broke, unclogged the sink, all while Sarah and the children slept or played video games, oblivious to the effort. Every small success, every little triumph, I quietly carried on my back. The more I gave, the more distant the household became. The kids adapted to the upgraded lifestyle with a rapidity that cut me to the bone. Private schools, new cars, trips to Florida, the newest iPhones, things I paid for, things I thought might buy them comfort, stability, maybe even a spark of gratitude, were quickly normalized. They expected them. And yet, whenever I tried to engage, to offer a word, a suggestion, a lecture on some minor misbehavior, I was dismissed. I was background noise in my own home. At the dinner table, they would roll their eyes, glance at Sarah, and say things like, "It's Mom's house," or, "You're not our dad," and Sarah would laugh it off or dismiss it, saying, "They're just teenagers. Don't take it personally." But I did. I could not take it personally. Each word, each smirk, each glance was a tiny fracture forming in the foundation I had spent years building. I watched them grow up in a world I had funded but from which I was deliberately excluded. Aiden's first car, his first out-of-state trip, the laptop that allowed him to game with friends, the new smartphone he treated as an extension of himself. These were my contributions, invisible because they were expected. Claire's first dress for the homecoming dance, the art supplies for her AP classes, the tutoring fees I quietly signed off for in the middle of the night. All unnoticed, unmentioned, taken for granted. When she applied to colleges, my name was not listed as a sponsor, though I had covered nearly all the costs. The acknowledgement of my existence in their lives had been reduced to a single function. A bank, a check, a silent provider. My voice, my presence, my sacrifices, they meant nothing unless they were tied to a dollar figure. I tried to remind myself that teenagers are cruel. I tried to rationalize, to maintain patience, to believe that respect would eventually grow from consistency. But the patterns persisted, and my silence became heavier than any word I could have spoken. They adapted to my generosity as a natural state, as though the world owed them everything I had labored to give. They demanded, assumed, and dismissed. And Sarah, in her quiet complicity, encouraged the dismissal. She never corrected them when they mocked me. She never affirmed my position in the house, never reminded them that the man paying for their luxuries and opportunities was also the one who bore the emotional and physical labor of keeping the household afloat. Her smiles, her casual remarks, her avoidance of conflict. It all became part of the machinery that erased my existence from the family's narrative. I would sit late at night, the house silent, counting receipts, bills, and bank transfers, letting the numbers tell me what the children never would. I calculated the hours, the money, the emotional labor I had invested. I thought of the renovations. The new roof, the kitchen tiles, the bathrooms that gleamed like mirrors. I thought of the salon, the early mornings and late nights, the meetings with lawyers, the endless calls with contractors and bankers. I thought of every time I had set aside my own desires, my own rest, to cover gaps in their lives, to keep them from feeling the precariousness of their reality. And I realized, slowly, like a blade pressing into my chest, that all of it had been invisible. All of it had been treated as nothing. I was ignored, dismissed, denied the smallest recognition of my labor, my presence, my role. I tried to talk to Sarah about it, gently at first, then with a quiet insistence that she acknowledge the problem. "I'm here," I said. "I'm part of this family. Don't they see that?" She would shake her head, sometimes with a sigh, sometimes with a small smile meant to soothe, and say, "They're teenagers. They'll come around. Stop worrying." But they never did. They never came around. And the more she ignored my plight, the more entrenched their dismissal became. My sacrifices became a natural law in their universe, expected, taken, unremarked. My presence, my name, my life was reduced to the function of paying, maintaining, and enduring. I was their invisible foundation, carrying weight no one saw, no one acknowledged, no one thanked. I began to notice subtle patterns that cut deeper than outright dismissal. When I spoke at the table, they answered through Sarah, as if my words needed her approval. When I tried to correct behavior, they waited for her intervention, ignoring me entirely. When bills arrived, they came with a shrug, an assumption that I had already taken care of them. When a birthday or holiday approached, they expected gifts, trips, indulgences, and they assumed my labor and money would bridge every gap. And in each of these moments, Sarah's silence loomed like a shadow, an affirmation that my presence could be minimized, erased, made irrelevant. I was a ghost living among the living, a man whose labor built their comfort while their hearts remained closed to me. At night, alone in the office, I would stare at the numbers on the screen, the spreadsheets that documented years of giving, and I would feel a hollowness that no human could fill. I realized then that respect, once absent, might never return. Gratitude might never be uttered. Love, if it existed, had been drowned in expectation. I had given everything, and they had given nothing back. I had built a life, carried a family, endured exhaustion, and been rewarded with contempt, silence, and dismissal. And I understood, finally, that I had been living not as a father, not as a husband, but as a silent, invisible ATM with a body, a man whose existence mattered only when it was convenient, when it could be spent, used, or consumed. I stayed in that quiet, heavy understanding, letting the hours stretch into nights, nights into weeks, weeks into years. And as I sat alone in the house I had helped sustain, surrounded by the evidence of my labor, receipts, bills, contracts, renovations, I realized that my patience had limits, that the years of sacrifice, the silent endurance, the careful, methodical building of a life that was supposed to be shared, had not earned me a seat at the table of respect. The children, the family, the home, they had all been mine in effort, but never in acknowledgement. And somewhere deep inside me, the first stirrings of a decision began to form. I would no longer be invisible. I would no longer endure contempt silently. And when the moment came, the world would finally understand that respect, once denied, demands its reckoning. The turning point came not with a fight, not with a scream, but with a quiet, deliberate act that split the room in two. Sarah had received a large inheritance from an aunt in Texas, millions in cash and a significant share of commercial real estate. I had known about it vaguely, a whispered conversation months earlier, framed as casual gossip, as if she were testing me for some reaction. That evening, the house was quiet. The children had been absorbed in screens, their laughter faint, a brittle shadow of the family life I had tried to build. Sarah walked into the kitchen and, without preamble, placed a folder on the table. A file of papers, crisp, heavy, ominous. "Now I have money," she said. Her voice was calm, measured, as though she were reading a statement aloud instead of delivering a verdict. "I don't need this marriage. You'll get nothing." I looked at the folder. Divorce papers. Plain, unadorned, but lethal in implication. The words felt like stones in my chest. I had built this life, carried it on my back, endured years of disregard, and in an instant, it was as if every effort were being erased. Aiden leaned by the doorway, smirking, his eyes alight with the cruelty of a child who had learned to wield wealth as a wee *p***n. Claire scrolled through her phone, pretending indifference, her body language declaring that she had already sided with the winner in this silent war. I stared at the papers and signed without a scene. I could feel the silence in the room swell, pressing against my ribs, louder than any shouting could have been. It was a verdict without trial, a sentence without judge or jury. That night, I visited our family attorney. The office smelled of leather, ink, and sterility. I laid out the prenuptial agreement we had signed years ago when we launched the salon together, before the business had turned a profit, before the renovations, before the children had become adept at ignoring my existence. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a kind of controlled rage. I made a copy, printed and bound, and returned home. The folder on the kitchen table had become a monument to contempt, but the contract in my hands was a tool, a blade hidden in paperwork. I placed it before Sarah. "Did you read Clause 12? I asked. My voice was soft, almost cordial, but with an edge that could cut through steel. She frowned, confusion flitting across her face, then irritation. "What clause?" she asked, dismissive, as if the question were absurd. I slid the paper toward her, letting her eyes trace the words I had rehearsed, the legal language designed to protect fairness, to punish overconfidence. Clause 12 stated that if the beneficiary of an inheritance initiated a divorce, the inherited assets were to be divided between both spouses. Half of the commercial properties, a significant portion of the funds, were now no longer hers alone. Her inheritance was no longer an untouchable fortress. Sarah's face went pale. Her usual composure faltered. Her eyes darted to the children, searching for some confirmation that she still held authority, that the narrative of dominance was intact. But Aiden and Claire were silent, observing the tension like spectators in a theater, not realizing the full magnitude of the shift. The air between us thickened, tense with a quiet anticipation. For the first time in years, the children had no superiority in their tone. For the first time, the room contained more than performance, it held reality. She accused me of manipulation, of cruelty. She called it unfair. But unfairness had been her tool all along, wielded with precision. She had assumed that years of financial dependence and silent labor would guarantee her dominance. She had assumed that my patience was infinite, that my investment in this family could be counted in dollars alone. She had assumed I would sign the papers, leave with nothing, and quietly disappear. She had miscalculated. I remember the moment I realized she had overplayed her hand. The calm, almost smug expression on her face cracked ever so slightly as the implications settled. The attorneys confirmed the enforceability of Clause 12, and I began to see the shift ripple outward. This was no longer about money. It was about the illusion of control she had maintained for a decade. For the first time, she was vulnerable. The kids noticed, too. Aiden, who had spent years perfecting a veneer of smug superiority, asked if we could talk as a family. The words were tentative, unsure, a reflection of the destabilization that Clause 12 had wrought in the household hierarchy. Claire's gaze was less scornful, tinged with the realization that the golden shield of inherited wealth and my silent labor could no longer protect her. Their confidence, honed over years of seeing me as a subordinate, began to crumble. The divorce proceeded, but now the terrain had shifted beneath us. I received my share of the inheritance, stepped away from the joint business, and let the consequences unfold. Sarah was forced to sell part of the property to meet her obligations. The house went on the market. Claire transferred to a less expensive university, facing the financial reality she had never been prepared to acknowledge. Aiden took a job at an auto repair shop, the first taste of work unmediated by my support. No one said I was worth nothing anymore. They didn't need to. They were living the proof. They were confronted by a reality where money could no longer guarantee obedience, where respect could not be bought, and where their illusions of dominance met the unyielding edge of truth. I remember walking through the house one last time before it was sold. The walls held echoes of laughter, arguments, dinners, and quiet resentments. Every corner was a memory of a life I had carried, sustained, sacrificed for, and yet never owned in the ways that mattered most. The air smelled faintly of polish and dust, a reminder that beauty could be built from labor, but not from recognition. Sarah avoided my gaze, moving through the rooms with the practiced calm of someone who had lost more than she realized. The children were distant, physically present but emotionally absent, caught between resentment and an unfamiliar uncertainty. I left the house and never returned. The drive away from Phoenix was silent, the desert stretching endlessly, indifferent, empty. I felt a strange mixture of liberation and lingering grief, the kind that settles deep in the chest and refuses to be shaken loose. I realized that the divorce, which Sarah had believed would leave me with nothing, had given me something far more valuable than money. It had stripped away obligation, pretense, and the corrosive illusion of a family that had never truly embraced me. It had revealed the truth, that respect, once denied, can sometimes only be reclaimed by enforcing boundaries, by letting reality speak for itself, and by stepping away from those who refuse to acknowledge the sacrifices they have received. In the end, the inheritance, the Clause 12, the attorneys, the contracts, they were symbols, tools, we *p***ns. They were nothing compared to the moral victory of reclaiming agency, of proving that a life spent in silent servitude need not end in erasure. And while the children and Sarah grappled with the consequences of their assumptions, I felt something I had not felt in years. Freedom. Freedom to live without compromise, without daily dismissal, without the constant ache of unacknowledged labor. Freedom to choose projects, investments, and relationships that demanded mutual respect. That night, alone in a small hotel room, I allowed myself to imagine the life I could now build. No longer bound to a household that had claimed me only for my financial utility. No longer tethered to the illusion of familial bonds that had been built on my invisibility. It was not happiness, not yet, but it was truth, and truth is heavier than any lie, and stronger than any obligation imposed without consent. Clause 12 had not just divided assets. It had divided the narrative of power. And I realized, with a kind of cold satisfaction, that sometimes the cost of overconfidence is the revelation that you are not as untouchable as you believe, and that sometimes the one who seems to hold nothing holds more than you ever anticipated. The attorneys confirmed what I already suspected. Clause 12 was enforceable. Every word, every sentence in that prenup we had signed years ago when we were just building the salon, now carried the full weight of justice. Half of the inheritance, half of the commercial properties were legally mine. The documents in my hands felt like instruments of a quiet vengeance, precise, unyielding, undeniable. Sarah's plan to erase me, to leave me with nothing, had crumbled not with anger, not with shouting, but with the quiet force of legal truth. It was the most devastating we *p* and a husband could wield, and I held it calmly, deliberately, without malice but with clarity. Sarah did not see it coming. Her usual composure faltered when I presented the enforceable agreement. She tried to maintain a facade of control, accusing me of manipulation, calling the situation unfair, as if initiating divorce with millions in her possession could somehow absolve her of consequence. Her words, once so confident, now trembled under the weight of their own futility. I watched her falter, saw the flicker of panic behind her eyes, the subtle tremor in her fingers as she turned over the legal documents again and again, looking for a loophole, a misstep, anything that might restore her illusion of invulnerability. The children noticed, too. For the first time in years, Aiden's smug superiority wavered. The sense of invincibility that comes from watching a man labor and pay for a life he will never own was disrupted. Claire, who had scrolled through my sacrifices with practiced indifference, looked up, her phone abandoned on the counter, her eyes scanning the kitchen for a hint of their mother's next move. They had no script for this. They had relied on my silence, my endurance, my willingness to carry everything without acknowledgement. Now the rules had changed. The adults in the room, the architects of their world, were no longer predictable. Sarah tried everything she could. She tried to bribe, to guilt, to charm. She accused me of betrayal. She called me greedy, cruel, manipulative. Every word was meant to destabilize me, to reclaim control she had assumed was permanent. But I had spent years watching her, studying her patterns, observing her manipulations, noting the moments when she took my generosity for granted. I had built a life in quiet labor, in unacknowledged effort, in patience tested daily. And now, I realized, the only way to reclaim my dignity was not through words, but through the enforcement of consequence. I remember sitting at the dining table that night, the contract spread before me like a map of victory. Sarah paced the kitchen behind me, her heels clicking against the hardwood, her voice rising and falling in bursts of exasperation. I barely looked up. I had reached a state of calm clarity, the kind that comes from a lifetime of endurance, from the slow accumulation of small betrayals, from watching one's self-respect slowly erode while the world ignores it. My hands rested lightly on the paper, tracing the words that granted me agency, that validated every year of silent labor, every check written, every sleepless night. "I will take my share," I said finally, my voice low, steady. Not a threat, not a plea, just a statement. The room contracted around those words. I could feel the tension, the disbelief. Sarah's lips parted, no sound emerging, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The children watched, their eyes wide, as the structure of authority they had assumed for so long began to shift beneath them. I felt no joy in their discomfort, no satisfaction in their shock. I felt the steady, undeniable pulse of justice. I felt freedom. The sale of part of the commercial property was necessary for Sarah to meet her obligations. The house, the home that had been mine in labor but not in title, went on the market. I walked through it one last time, touching the edges of countertops, the door frames, the walls that had absorbed years of my presence. Everything I had built, sustained, sacrificed for was now a memory, a legacy that belonged to them but had never been recognized. Claire transferred to a less expensive university. Aidan took a job at an auto repair shop, tasting the first bitter lessons of life unmediated by my finances. The family, who had taken my labor for granted, were now confronted by reality. One they had assumed they could manipulate at will, one they were forced to acknowledge because the scaffolding I had provided was no longer infinite. The legal papers, the transfer of assets, the enforcement of Clause 12, these were tools, instruments, mechanisms of change. But the real shift happened quietly, in the air, in the way the children no longer looked at me with the automatic expectation of my presence as a provider, in the way Sarah moved through the house, her usual assuredness replaced with the careful, measured steps of someone navigating consequences she had underestimated. For the first time in years, the power dynamic had shifted. The illusion of permanence that money and expectation had created was gone, replaced by reality. I felt the weight of all those years lift, a strange combination of relief and melancholy. Relief that my labor was finally acknowledged, even if indirectly. Melancholy that acknowledgement had come in the form of enforced consequence rather than gratitude, that it required a dismantling of a life I had built piece by piece. But I also understood something essential. The family had learned a truth that money could not shield them from. Respect and acknowledgement have a cost, and when they are withheld, the cost eventually comes due. That evening, I sat alone in a modest hotel room, the city lights outside flickering against the windows, small, distant, and indifferent. I reflected on the years of silent labor, of being treated as an invisible pillar, of bearing responsibility without recognition. I thought about the children's faces as they realized that my presence was not infinite, that the financial scaffolding they had relied upon could be withdrawn. I thought about Sarah's expression as she understood the limitations of control, the limits of her assumptions, the reality that my patience had boundaries that her money could not erase. And I understood that freedom was a far more potent inheritance than any sum of cash. In the quiet, I traced the lessons I had learned, that loyalty without respect is vulnerability, that endurance without acknowledgement becomes exploitation, that the most valuable tools in life are sometimes the legal ones, the documented ones, the undeniable ones. I had exercised power without cruelty, clarity without malice, and in doing so, reclaimed the respect that had been denied for over a decade. The house, the money, the salon, the inheritance, they were all pieces of a puzzle, but the real piece I had regained was myself. My agency, my ability to say enough and have the world acknowledge it. The family I left behind, the children and Sarah, would carry the lessons of Clause 12 forward, whether they understood it fully or not. And I, for the first time in years, would carry nothing but the freedom to choose my path, to invest in what mattered to me, to live in the light of truth rather than in the shadows of obligation. That night, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed of a hotel room, I allowed myself the rarest thing I had known in over a decade, the feeling of being truly unburdened. Clause 12 had done more than protect my share. It had restored my dignity. It had reminded me that even in the face of betrayal, even in the face of assumed dominance and contempt, the rules of fairness can still be enforced. That the overconfidence of those who believe themselves untouchable is the softest target for the one who has endured. And I understood, finally, that the quiet patience I had cultivated was not weakness. It was preparation. Preparation for the moment when justice, silent and precise, could finally be applied. I remember the drive out of Phoenix like it was a funeral procession for the life I had carried and yet never owned. The desert stretched on either side, endless, unbroken, indifferent, and I felt a quiet emptiness that was not grief exactly, but the hollow space left when responsibility is lifted, when obligation ends, and when the weight you have borne for years is finally removed. I had my share of the inheritance, yes, the assets and money that had once seemed like the final battleground. But what mattered far more than the money was the proof it gave me. I could walk away, unbowed, unbent, uncompromised. All those years of silent labor, unnoticed sacrifice, of bending to the children's whims and Sarah's quiet complicity, they had not broken me. They had sharpened me. And now, at 52, I was free. I settled in a modest home in Colorado, far from the life that had consumed me. The house was small, unremarkable, nothing like the one I had rebuilt in Phoenix, but it was mine in every sense that mattered. No whispers of contempt, no subtle smirks, no silence that carried accusation. Just space, light, and the quiet affirmation that I could live for myself. I opened a small consulting practice. I took on projects I chose, invested in ventures I believed in. My labor now was for me, and for the first time it was acknowledged in the only ways that ever truly mattered: effort, engagement, results, autonomy. No one could tell me that my contribution was nothing, because I no longer needed their recognition to validate my existence. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that evening in Phoenix, the night Sarah placed the divorce papers on the table and said, "You'll get nothing." I remember the hush of the room, the smirk on Aiden's face, Claire scrolling through her phone as though my presence had been irrelevant for years. The moment when everything I had carried, all the financial, emotional, and physical labor, seemed as if it could vanish at a word. And yet I had been ready. Clause 12 had been my shield and my sword, a precise, silent justice that ensured I did not leave empty-handed. But more than that, it reminded me that respect isn't merely given, and patience isn't endless. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. Sarah scrambled to sell assets, to balance budgets, to confront the reality she had never considered. Claire transferred to a less expensive university, learning in a sudden, harsh way that her privileges were not eternal. Aiden took a job at an auto repair shop, for the first time feeling the bite of responsibility unmediated by my support. No lectures, no arguments, no tears would change the fact that the world could not be ignored, that respect costs more than the currency of complacency, and that reliance on another's labor without acknowledgement carries consequences. They learned it in the hardest way. by feeling what it is to be stripped of expectation, the expectation they had long taken for granted. I walk through my new home now, and every surface, every wall, every corner reflects choice and intention. I painted it myself. I fixed the plumbing myself. I chose the furniture, the layout, the books on the shelves. Each object carries weight because it is mine, because it was decided by me, because it bears no legacy of contempt, no shadow of unacknowledged labor. In Phoenix, the house had been my canvas, but it had been a canvas where everyone painted over my work with indifference. Here, every brushstroke is mine alone. I work differently now. I take on projects that challenge me, that demand engagement, that reward my input in measurable ways. No one is there to dismiss my effort, to ignore my presence, to treat my labor as invisible. I invest in ventures with care, sometimes cautiously, sometimes boldly, but always with the assurance that my contributions will be recognized in the only currency that matters. Results earned, effort seen, and autonomy maintained. Freedom, I have learned, is not merely the absence of constraint, it is the presence of agency. And now, I feel it in every decision, every investment, every late night spent building something for myself rather than carrying the weight of ungrateful dependence. There are nights, though, when the memory of the family I left behind surfaces. I see Aiden's smirk, Claire's indifferent gaze, Sarah's measured tone, all ghosts lingering at the corners of my mind. I imagine the arguments that unfolded in Phoenix after I enforced Clause 12, the tension that crackled in the air, the realization spreading across the faces of those who had assumed my patience was infinite. I imagine Claire transferring schools, Aiden stepping into a reality unbuffered by my presence, and Sarah confronting the limitations of wealth when it is wielded without respect. I feel a pang of melancholy, not regret, not longing, but recognition of a life once carried and now released. I do not miss the house. I do not miss the labor. I do not miss the contempt. I miss the illusion, the belief that sacrifice alone could forge bonds, the hope that patience would elicit gratitude. That was a lie I told myself, a comforting lie. The truth is sharper. Bonds forged without respect are fragile, and endurance without acknowledgement is a form of servitude. I spent 11 years paying in full with interest, and for what? For the affirmation that I could sustain a life for others while my own presence was ignored, dismissed, minimized. Clause 12 was my reckoning, but freedom is my inheritance. I sit at my desk now in Colorado, overlooking the mountains. I drink coffee in the morning, tea in the afternoon, sometimes bourbon at night. The light falls through the window in patterns that shift slowly as the day moves across the sky. It is quiet. It is mine. No one interrupts, no one judges, no one disregards. I think about the night Sarah said, "You'll get nothing." She was wrong. I got the most important thing. Not money, not property, not legal victories, but proof that respect, once denied, can be reclaimed. That freedom, once sought, can be earned even in the harshest circumstances. And that the labor of a lifetime need not end in invisibility if one has the courage to enforce boundaries, to demand recognition, to act when silence and contempt have become intolerable. Sometimes I imagine a confrontation, a word, a phone call from Phoenix, a fleeting thought of the lives I left behind. But I am calm. I have measured the cost, the consequences, the lessons, and I do not waver. Respect is not a gift. Respect is a currency, and I have learned to demand it, to enforce it, to accept it only when it is offered willingly. All else is optional. I live differently now. I work for myself. I invest in myself. I choose every day how to expend energy, time, and resources. And in doing so, I feel a liberation I never knew was possible. Clause May 12th have enforced fairness, but freedom, true, unshackled freedom, is what I carry now. And it is worth more than anything Sarah ever inherited, more than anything the children ever received, more than any home, car, or trip I once provided. And in that freedom, I ask myself quietly, would you have endured it? Would you have stayed silent, carried the weight, tolerated contempt, and then, when the moment came, acted decisively to reclaim both respect and agency? Or would you have faltered, allowed yourself to be erased, allowed the years of labor to be counted as nothing? I have learned the answer and I carry it every day. I am free. The house is sold. The children are confronted with consequence. Sarah is tempered by reality. And I, finally, live as the man I was always meant to be, unbound, respected, and sovereign over the life I choose to lead. Freedom, it turns out, is not a reward. It is a decision, and I chose it.